The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association prided itself on being the kind of community that appeared in local real estate brochures, manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, a neighborhood newsletter printed on cardstock with a little cartoon, Robin in the corner. From the outside, it looked like the American dream arranged in a coal-d-sack. Melissa Hartley had moved her family there 3 years ago, back when hope still felt like something you could build a house on. She was a former dental hygienist who'd left her job to care full-time for her daughter. Chloe, after the diagnosis, came down like an axe. Pulmonary arterial hypertension, a disease that attacks the arteries of the lungs, starving the heart of pressure, making every breath a negotiation with the body. Chloe had been 10 when they first heard the words. She was 12 now, and she had learned, in the particular way that sick children do, to be braver than adults twice her age. Chloe Hartley was a small girl with a big laugh. She had her father's dark blue eyes and her mother's stubbornness. She wore her oxygen cannula like it was a fashion accessory, sometimes clipping little plastic charms to the tubing, and she refused, absolutely refused, to be defined by the tank that followed her everywhere on its small-wheeled cart. She called it Chester. "Chester and I are going to the mailbox," she'd announced, dragging her portable concentrator behind her like a wagon. The neighbors who bothered to know her loved her for it. Not everyone bothered to know her. Sandra Whitfield had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 11 years. She served on the HOA board as compliance officer, a title she had lobbied to create herself, and she wielded it with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her entire life for institutional authority. Sandra was 54, with the posture of a school principal and the energy of a grievance collector. She kept a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws in her car. She had memorized the section on visual aesthetics and common area standards, the way some people memorize scripture. She had issued 17 formal complaints in the past calendar year. 2 to the Garcias on Birchwood Lane, for wind chimes she deemed audibly intrusive. 1 to the elderly Mr. Pompelli, for a garden gnome positioned, in her estimation, too close to the sidewalk easement. 3 to the Hartleys for a small ramp Melissa had installed near the front door for the oxygen cart, for a rubber threshold strip across the porch, and 4, bafflingly, the cart itself being stored on the front porch overnight twice in October. Melissa had responded to each complaint with careful, measured letters. She'd included a copy of Chloe's diagnosis. She'd cited the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. She'd been patient. She'd been polite. She'd been the kind of reasonable that people are when they don't yet understand that reason has nothing to do with it. What Melissa didn't fully grasp, not yet, was that Sandra didn't see a sick child when she looked at Chloe. She saw a variable, a disruption in the visual continuity of the neighborhood she had appointed herself to protect. He saw a tank on wheels that didn't appear anywhere in the approved list of permitted exterior equipment. And she saw a mother who kept sending letters back, which was, in Sandra's experience, a form of insubordination. The Hartleys had tried to make peace. Melissa brought a casserole to the HOA holiday gathering that December. Chloe had drawn a little Christmas card for the board members. Sandra had thanked them both with the warmth of a form letter. Tom Hartley, Melissa's husband, worked long hours as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm outside of Columbus. He was a calm, broad-shouldered man who believed deeply in solving problems before they got bigger, which meant he'd attended 2 HOA meetings to address Sandra's complaints in person. Both times he was told the matter was under review. Both times he drove home feeling like he'd tried to shake hands with a closed fist with the children in the neighborhood, though they had no such complications. Kids understand things there. Parents complicate. On the block, Chloe was simply Chloe, the girl who knew every bird species by sight, who could name all 50 state capitals in alphabetical order, who once organized a lemonade stand to raise money for the children's pulmonary ward where she'd spent 3 weeks the previous spring. She'd raised $412. She'd done it while tethered to Chester. The afternoon of April 14th began like any other, a Tuesday. The sky was the pale blue of new denim, and the dogwood trees along the street were just beginning to bloom, small white flowers appearing at the tips of branches, like something the neighborhood had been quietly promising all winter. Chloe had come home from school and wanted to sit outside. This was not unusual. She liked the porch, liked the air, liked watching the sparrows fight over the feeder Melissa had hung from the oak tree at the edge of the yard. Melissa set her up with a blanket, a juice box, and a library book about marine biology. Chloe had recently decided she wanted to be an oceanographer, reasoning that the ocean had more unexplored territory than outer space, which seemed, to her, more interesting. Chester sat beside her chair, humming softly, screen indicator light steady and calm. It was by every measure a perfectly ordinary afternoon. Sandra Whitfield's white sedan turned into the cul-de-sac at 3:47 p.m. Melissa was inside, washing dishes, when she heard her daughter's voice. Not frightened. Not at first. But sharp, confused. The kind of voice a child uses when something doesn't make sense yet. Then she heard the clatter. Then she heard nothing from Chloe at all. Melissa dropped the glass she was holding. It didn't shatter. It bounced once against the rubber mat in the sink, but she was already moving before it landed, drying her hands on her jeans as she pushed through the screen door and onto the porch. What she saw stopped her for one terrible second. Just one. The second it takes for the brain to refuse what the eyes are reporting. Chloe was on the porch boards, half slumped against the railing post. Her lips tinted the faintest blue at the edges. Chesta, the oxygen was 4 feet away from her, its tubing disconnected, the cannula dangling free. The cart tipped at an angle where it had been shoved. Sandra Whitfield stood at the base of the porch steps, her chin elevated, a piece of paper in one hand, and the expression of someone who believed they were doing the right thing. I issued this notice 2 weeks ago, Sandra was saying, her voice the cool, administrative tone of someone reading from a script they have rehearsed. Equipment stored on the exterior of the residence constitutes a violation of Section 7. Paragraph C of the Willowbrook Estates. Chloe? Melissa was past Sandra before Sandra finished the sentence. She was on her knees on the porch boards, her hands on her daughter's face, her voice trying to be calm the way voices are when the person speaking them is not calm at all. Chloe, baby, look at me. Chloe's eyes were open but glassy. She was breathing. Melissa could see the shallow, rapid movement of her chest, but every inhale was audible, labored, the kind of breath that sounds like it costs something. Without the supplemental oxygen, her body was fighting. Pulmonary arterial hypertension doesn't give you much margin. What oxygen there is doesn't move efficiently enough. The disease had already narrowed her reserves. This was not a situation with room for delay. She needs her oxygen, Melissa said, grabbing the cannula, reconnecting the tubing with shaking hands, checking the flow dial. The green light blinked twice and steadied. She positioned the cannula back under Chloe's nose, pressed her forehead to her daughter's. Breathe, honey. I've got you. Breathe. Behind her, Sandra was still talking. I understand you believe there are medical circumstances, but the HOA bylaws do not include a blanket exemption for *, call 911. Melissa screamed it over her shoulder. In the raw volume of it, the sound of a mother on the register beyond fear finally cracked something in the afternoon. A neighbor across the street, Dana Kowalski, who had been pulling groceries from her trunk, stopped, looked, dropped her bags, and ran inside for her phone. Sandra did not call 911. Sandra took a step backward. The next 9 minutes were the longest of Melissa Hartley's life. She held Chloe's hand and talked to her, steady and low. The way you talk someone back from a ledge, not the words mattering so much as the voice. The presence. The proof that someone is there and not leaving. Chloe's color came back slowly, pink returning to her lips by degrees, her breathing easing from that terrible ragged labor into something more controlled. The oxymon was doing its work. But the damage of those minutes without it, the strain, on a heart already working too hard, was not nothing. It was never nothing. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They were efficient and kind. They spoke to Chloe in the direct, respectful way that good emergency workers speak to children, not talking over her or around her. Her oxygen saturation had dropped to 81%, dangerously low for a healthy person, catastrophic for someone with her condition. They stabilized her on the porch, took her vitals, asked Melissa questions she answered in a voice that had gone very quiet and very precise. They transported Chloe to Riverside Children's Hospital. Melissa rode in the back, holding her daughter's hand, watching the monitors, not looking at anything else. Tom got the call at 4:06 p.m. He left the job site without a word to anyone, drove 40 minutes in 27, and was in the emergency department waiting area before they'd finished the intake paperwork. He sat beside Melissa in a plastic chair and took her hand, and neither of them said much, because there are moments in a marriage, in a life, where language is too slow. Sandra Whitfield drove home. She sent an email to the full HOA board at 5:15 p.m., noting that she had attempted to issue a compliance notice at the Hartley property, and that the situation had escalated due to the homeowner's emotional response. She attached a copy of Section 7, Paragraph C. At the hospital, the attending cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, explained what had happened in measured, clinical terms. The sustained hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, had placed significant stress on Chloe's right ventricle. It was not a heart attack, but it was not nothing. They would monitor her overnight, run an echocardiogram in the morning, adjust her medication if necessary. She was stable. She was stable. Melissa asked Dr. Nguyen to say it a third time, and the doctor understood, and did. Chloe, from her hospital bed, hooked 2 monitors and an IV, and the hospital's own oxygen supply. Asked if Chester was okay. Tom told her Chester was fine. She said good, because Chester didn't like being left alone. Then she fell asleep, and her parents sat on either side of her bed in the blue hospital dark, and listened to her breathe out in the Willowbrook Estates. The newsletter was already being drafted for the following week. The Katoon robin smiled from its corner. The dogwood trees continued to bloom. Chloe came home from the hospital on a Thursday, 2 days after she'd been taken in. She came home too. Balloons. Dana Kowalski had organized the block, and to a banner that Chloe's best friend, Paige, had painted by hand, in uneven block letters. Welcome home, Chloe and Chester. The neighbors who'd watched the ambulance come stood in their driveways and waved. Several of them cried. One of them, Mr. Pompelli, the man with the garden gnome, brought a plate of cookies he'd baked himself. Sandra Whitfield's house had its blinds closed. The story had not stayed quiet. Dana Kowalski had recorded part of the incident on her phone. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. She'd hesitated, initially, about posting it, talking it over with her husband that night in the way people do when they know something is significant. She posted it on Friday morning, a week before Chloe came home, with a simple caption, "This is my neighbor. She is 12. The woman in this video disconnected her oxygen equipment. Her name is Sandra Whitfield and she is the HOA compliance officer for Willowbrook Estates. By Sunday, it had been viewed 1.2 million times. By Tuesday, when Chloe was still in the hospital, it had been covered by 3 local television stations and picked up by a national outlet. The comment sections were, in the way of internet comment sections, not entirely suitable for description, but the core sentiment was uniform. Fury. The Willowbrook Estates, HOA received, by conservative estimate, 4,000 emails in 5 days. The board president, a mild-mannered retired accountant named Gerald Fossey, later described the experience as like standing in front of a firehouse. Several board members quietly told journalists, on background, that Sandra had acted without board authorization. Sandra herself released a statement through a hastily hired PR person that characterized her actions as a routine compliance visit that was mischaracterized by partial video footage. The statement made things worse. Melissa and Tom, through everything, were deliberate and quiet. They had hired an attorney, Rebecca Cho, a disability rights lawyer out of Columbus with 15 years of experience, and the kind of calm ferocity that good lawyers cultivate the way other people cultivate patience. Rebecca held a single press statement on the front steps of the Hartley home, with Chloe still in the hospital, and Tom standing at Melissa's side. What happened to Chloe Hartley was not a paperwork error, Rebecca said. It was not a misunderstanding about bylaws. A medical device was physically interfered with, a device a child needed to survive. We will be pursuing every available legal avenue, including federal civil rights claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, as well as personal liability claims against the individual involved. This was not a compliance issue, this was an assault. The word assault landed in the national coverage like a stone in still water. Columbus PD had already opened an investigation. The detective assigned to the case, a quiet woman named Rivera, had reviewed the video and taken statements from Melissa, from Dana, and from 2 other neighbors who had witnessed portions of the incident. The question of whether Sandra had physically moved the cart, disconnecting the tubing, or whether Chloe's movement away from it had caused the disconnection was the central factual dispute. The video showed Sandra's hand near the cart. It showed the cart moving. It showed Chloe's face, and then Chloe's absence from frying, and then the sound of her hitting the porch boards. Sandra maintained she had only gestured at the equipment while serving the notice and that the cart had been unstable. Neighbors who had been watching maintained otherwise. That the HOA, in an emergency board meeting held via video call on the Wednesday after the incident, voted to suspend Sandra's position pending review. The vote was 5-1. Sandra was the one. Inside the Hartley home, the phone rang constantly. Melissa answered some of the calls. Melissa let go to voicemail strangers, reporters, a few people from Chloe's school, and at least 3 separate GoFundMe campaigns that had been started without the family's knowledge. Tom fielded the legal calls. Rebecca handled the press. They had, in the efficient way of people managing a crisis on insufficient sleep, divided the labor. They could not divide was the weight of it. The particular heaviness of knowing that your child, your 12-year-old daughter, who named her oxygen tank and wanted to study the ocean, had nearly died in the sunshine on her own front porch, in her own neighborhood, because someone had decided that a piece of medical equipment violated the visual standards of a residential community. Chloe, for her part, was less interested in the coverage than in the cookies Mr. Pompelli had brought. She ate 2, and declared them legitimately excellent. She asked her mother, once, why the lady had moved Chester. Melissa didn't have an answer that made sense, because there wasn't one. She told Chloe that some people became so focused on rules that they forgot to look at the person the rule was affecting. Chloe considered this for a moment. That's a weird way to live, she said. Bots and Melissa agreed that it was. The legal process, as legal processes do, moved slowly and then all at once. Sandra Whitfield was charged with reckless endangerment in September of that same year, 5 months after the incident. The Franklin County District Attorney's Office, under considerable public attention, determined that sufficient evidence existed to support the charge, citing the video footage, witness testimony, and medical documentation of Chloe's condition and the consequences of oxygen deprivation. It was not the most serious charge that had been discussed in the initial weeks, but it was real and it was formal, and it meant Sandra would face a judge. This civil lawsuit, filed by Rebecca Cho on behalf of the Hartley family, named Sandra Whitfield individually and the Willowbrook Estates HOA as defendants. It alleged violations of the Fair Housing Act's disability provisions, the ADA, and Ohio tort law, the HOA's insurance carrier. After consulting with their own attorneys and reviewing the video for what was reportedly a very short meeting, reached out about settlement discussions within 60 days of the filing. The settlement amount was sealed, as settlements are. What was not sealed, because it was a condition the Hartleys insisted upon, and Rebecca Cho negotiated in writing, was the policy reform. Willowbrook Estates was required to adopt a formal reasonable accommodation policy for residents with disabilities, to undergo HOA board training on fair housing law, and to post the contact information for the Ohio Civil Rights Commission in all future newsletters. The cartoon Robin would share space with something more useful. Sandra's criminal case concluded in February of the following year. She accepted a plea, a reduced charge of misdemeanor negligence, with a fine, mandatory community service, and 2 years of probation. She did not go to prison. Whether justice, in the abstract philosophical sense, was achieved depends on who you ask and what you believe justice is built to do. What was achieved was a record, a consequence. Her name, attached to what she had done, in a document that would outlast the news cycle, the HOA. Under new leadership, Gerald Fossey had stepped down, citing his health, sent the Hartley family a formal letter of apology. It was 3 paragraphs. Melissa read it once and put it in a drawer. She wasn't sure it belonged on the refrigerator next to Chloe's marine biology drawings. But she wasn't sure it belonged in the trash either. It existed in a category of things that are offered when words are all that's left. What changed in Willowbrook Estates was subtler and more durable than any of the legal outcomes. The neighbors, who had watched from driveways and grocery bags, began, in the months that followed, to watch differently, to show up. Dana Kowalski started a neighborhood group chat that was, unlike most neighborhood group chats, actually warm people, sharing surplus garden vegetables, asking for restaurant recommendations, checking in on Mr. Pompelli when his car hadn't moved in a few days. Chloe's lemonade stand became an annual event, formally this time, with a permit from the city, and a banner, and a folding table from the community association. Chloe herself returned to school that fall with a letter from the district officially recognizing Chester as a required medical accommodation. Not that this should have ever required a letter. But letters are what institutions produce when they want to demonstrate they have learned something. She carried it in her backpack, folded, next to a diagram of deep-sea hydrothermal vents she'd printed from a National Geographic database. She was 13 by then, taller by 1.5 inches, with new glasses she'd chosen herself round. Wireframes, she said, made her look like a scientist, which was, she explained to anyone who asked, entirely the point. She was still on Chester. She would be for the foreseeable future, the disease being the kind that doesn't resolve so much as it is managed, year by careful year. But the right ventricle, Dr. Nguyen reported at the 6-month follow-up, had not sustained lasting damage from that April afternoon. It had been stressed, and it had recovered, and it was doing the stubborn, extraordinary work of keeping Chloe Hartley alive. Melissa gave an interview to a disability rights organization that sprang, speaking about the Fair Housing Act and what the law actually required HOAs to understand, the kind of practical, unglamorous advocacy that doesn't trend on social media but matters enormously to the people who need it. Tom went back to work and, quietly, donated a portion of his overtime to the children's pulmonary ward where Chloe had once raised $412 from a lemonade stand. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly, with a bow tied around the injustice and a lesson delivered. That version is not the true one. What's true is that families like the Hartleys should never have had to fight this battle. What's true is that the law existed before April 14th and did not prevent what happened. What's true is that Chloe Hartley spent minutes without adequate oxygen on her own front porch, because a woman decided that a set of neighborhood static standards mattered more than a child's life. And what's also true, because truth, like most things, doesn't come in single colors, is that a 12-year-old girl pulled Chester home from the hospital and positioned him next to her chair on the porch and sat in the April sunlight.